South of town, a woman called Effie Williams shot and murdered her friend Effie Mills because they were running a disorderly house, if you get the meaning, on a house row, and she was afraid that Effie Mills was going to be some sort of wanting her husband or wanting the lover that she had at that moment. So she was shot and killed. So the town was familiar with various murders that were occurring and disputes that were occurring in town. And several people said, you know, crime is going up in this town. Then a very unpleasant thing started to happen in that the murders became distinctly ethnic. Now let's have a look at those immigrants for a moment, right? 40 different countries in this town. There was a Chinese laundry on that side of the square. There were 60 Jewish families with a synagogue down on 15th and Terry. There were 486 African Americans in the town. And there were people not just from the usual Northern European towns and cities and countries, but there were people from Syria and Italy and Turkey and Croatia. This was an incredibly diverse population, and I would have loved to have been here on a Saturday night when all the stores were open on the square and people had paid their nickels to travel on the interurban train, and here were all the women in babushkas and babies on their arms, and what an atmosphere the whole town was. But there were disputes. So with this whole ethnic environment then, there started to be some ethnic murders. The very first one was Pearl Traxler. Pearl Traxler was shot and killed at a little dance hall north of town by Frank D'Angelo. Now you're going to notice now the names become distinctly Italian and Sicilian. And one explanation for that. Remember that both southern Italy and Sicily, there was absolute grinding poverty. And not only grinding poverty there, but all authority was totally corrupted. You couldn't report something that would be done against you. So what had happened in Sicily in 1750, 26 years before Declaration of Independence, people in Sicily had formed an organization called La Mano Nera, the Black Hand. And that is the early name for the mafia. It will be brought into America, some people believe, through New Orleans. It started out in Sicily as not bad at all. It guaranteed insurances to people. It gave money at a funeral if the family couldn't afford it. And that same principle started out in America, but then it became horribly corrupted. It started targeting Italians and Sicilians, and then the general population, who appeared to be financially successful. The more successful, the bigger the target. So what now started happening was, it started with a coal miner in 1911 in Seymour. His name was Bianchi Luisi. And he turned to friends and he said, I've been told to blow up the house by dynamite of the town marshal of Seymour. And he says, I'm not going to do it. He then received a letter. He didn't explain what the letter was like, and the letter threatened his life. He chose suicide instead, throwing himself down one of the coal mine shafts in Seymour. That's the first time I could track this Black Hand letter. Others followed. One of the men working on the railroad came up to the police station and said, you're going to have to give me protection. They said, what for? He said, I am afraid of my life. I've got friends out west. If you just give me protection till I get out to be with them. They did. And a miner was going round the town, and he had his hand in his pocket and was sticking it out as though he had a gun in there. And the police said, why are you doing that? And he said, I'm afraid of the gang. They're going to kill me, you know. They put him in Mount Pleasant Asylum. There were other Black Hand letters that started to arrive. The police got them. The mayor got one. A businessman called Noah Ressler on the south side of the square was asked to leave slowly people began to think, well, what is this, these letters? And it all came to being obvious on the night of October the 31st, 1918, when a house was almost blown to smithereens on the corner of West Van Buren and 10th Street. Tony DeZorzi was the owner. And when the police got there, his family escaped. But when the police got there, he produced 3 letters and showed them the letters. 2 of the letters were postmarked Chicago, one of them Pennsylvania. One of them from Chicago showed the clear imprint of a hand that had been dipped in some kind of dye and put on the page. And with that 3rd letter, there was a very precise artist's drawing of Tony DeZorzi lying in his coffin with a stiletto knife sticking out of his heart. When the bloodhounds came to try and track who had put this dynamite at Tony DeZorzi's house, they go south of town, and at this point, the crime seems to congregate, the worst crimes, south of Centerville, places like 30 and Gallyville. South of town then, we know that there were lots of Italians living in places like 30. If you drive past it today, it's just a sort of a bump on the ground, but it must have been some enormous place. And anarchists were there that refused to sign up to go and fight in World War I. I mean, it had to be a really dynamite location, and I don't mean dynamite I was given there. It's other meaning of the word crime. So crime started happening south of town. We know in Gallyville, a man called Sisto Veretti shot and killed Benedetto Galvan through the doorway and then committed suicide. Coming a little closer into town on South 18th Street and Stewart, Bianchi Trapino was found, his throat cut from ear to ear. He'd been dragged clearly from the east because they could see the blood dragging in the snow, and 2 sets of footprints that had pulled his body right up to that railroad track that came up there to make it look, of course, as though the railroad, the engine had gone over the man's neck, and of course it hadn't. Now, there was a suspect immediately, and his name was Ben Zuccarelli. He'd already escaped from a prison in Illinois and had committed murder, which had put him in there, but he'd escaped. Ben Zuccarelli was taken by his wife to Langford Funeral Home, and they looked at the body in the coffin of Trapino, and then against the will of Ben Zuccarelli, his wife almost dragged him to the coffin and forced him to kiss Trapino. And that was a southern Italian Sicilian belief that if you kissed the body of the person that you'd hurt, they would not haunt your dreams. So these principles that they brought in from these cultures with them produced a really violent kind of culture.